Koto, and very warm Pacific greetings. I acknowledge the people of the land, Tanaka Makawa, and also the people of South Auckland, specifically all of you educators who day in, day out go to extraordinary lengths to ensure that kids' life chances are improved. I think that's probably the overriding reason why we're here. Peter and I are going to do an Irish double act this morning. We're not excluding Martin. If he wants to become an honorary Hothrut, then that's fine. We agreed that the best division of our labour for the next wee while is for me to summarise again the main points that arose from the Massey University policy group's look at the research evidence on the kinds of effects that charter schools have in local communities. Not just the effects they have on individual children and on individual schools, but our starting point was very much the idea that schools are the hubs of their community, that if you do something in a school, you also have to consider the effects on the community at large. And so that's the stance that I'll be taking. And then Peter's got the wonderful opportunity to say all the things that I'm not able to say because I'm trying to be a responsible, disinterested academic. So if my views on charter schools come through, then it's by accident. Okay, and we've got around about 20 minutes here. So, what are charter schools? Our policy group took the government's laudable intentions at face value. We said, okay, the government says that we have a problem with underachievement in schools. There are significant numbers of students in schools who aren't fulfilling their potential. The problem is in the schools, not in the wider society. Therefore, we need to look overseas to try and find answers, because overseas they have found the answers. Overseas they've solved the problem of educational inequality that's escaped everybody for nearly 200 years. Fantastic. So we said, let's look at the evidence to see whether the claims that are being made by the National Act Party stand up to scrutiny. Now, the basic problem is that when politicians talk to each other at these overseas junkets, or when bureaucrats talk to each other about the policies that they've implemented in overseas jurisdictions, they tend only to present the evidence from their own in-house evaluations of what's gone on. And the whole point of the exercise is peacock politics. It's to try and show that your policies work perfectly, and therefore you ought to receive all the plaudits for having implemented wonderful policies. Whereas as soon as you start to look at the independent evidence from people who have no vested interest in showing whether or not these policies work, that's when the cracks start to appear. So most of the politicians in this country will draw on research that's produced by right-wing think tanks or advocates of charter schools. And of course those groups aren't necessarily interested in presenting a balanced view of the evidence. They're interested in demonstrating that their view of the world should prevail. So charter schools are a good thing. Here is some evidence that charter schools work. And our role as educators is quite a different. Is to say we work butts off day in, day out to support kids. We struggle extraordinarily hard, particularly as Martin said, in lower decile communities, to ensure that kids have a good education day in, day out. And our starting point is first do no harm. Unless you can convince us absolutely that on balance it's worth even trying these new experiments, and they are experiments, then we shouldn't go there, because there's too much at risk. We have too much to lose. We have a fragile classroom, school, early childhood centre environment that we maintain and try to enrich each day. And and we're not going to countenance anything that may risk that. Kids' experiences are too important. So what is a charter school venture? Well, the problem is it can mean anything you like. Yeah? It's just a label. It's not a theory of education, it's not a pedagogy, it's not a set of relations, it's simply a label. Second feature of overseas initiatives, and we looked at the same countries as the government, the United States, Sweden and England. Second feature is that they're all done as natural experiments. It's the Nike model, let's just do it. Okay? Martin was being very polite when he said over time educators might make national standards work. Well, my view is they shouldn't even have to be tried, because the evidence already exists that if you introduce national standards, the chances are greater that you're going to cause harm than that you're going to cause good. And the third point about all these overseas experiments is one that Martin stated very clearly and eloquently, that when you have standards and high stakes as part of the mix, that's when the most disadvantaged kids are most likely to suffer. So there's a complete paradox in government policy. Government rightly says we want to do something for the kids who are most disadvantaged, but what it fails to realise is that when you add standards and high stakes to that mix, you're actually working against your own best intentions. So the characteristic features of all charter school experiments internationally are that they mix choice. Choice is supposed to be a good thing. In education it's not. The evidence is that if you have choice plus diversity, so different kinds of schools and an ability to choose between them, then the families who can best gain that system to their own advantage are the families with more family resources, families with more cultural capital, the middle class and professional families who know how to play the game. So as soon as you move away from a relatively homogenous public schooling system to one that includes diversity and choice, you end up giving an inherent advantage to families that are already better off. Yeah? And the rich get richer in a choice and diversity system. The toxic component of the mix is adding standards to that. Because as soon as you add standards to the mix, you get these tendencies towards unprofessional and unethical practices which say we don't want these students because they'll make our results look worse. We'll be worse in every behaviour. So the basic message from all the charter school experiments, which none of the charter school components actually admit to, is that most of the elements in the mix, the ideology that this will work and we have choice, diversity and standards, is entirely wrong, because it adversely affects kids who are already at the bottom of the hill most. So we looked first at free schools in Sweden, then at the academies program in England, charter schools in the United States, and believe it or not, charter schools in New Zealand. And in all four of those jurisdictions, charter schools on different models have been in place for 20 years. There is no effect that suggests that structural educational inequalities have been reduced or removed over that time. Any changes or improvements to the system have been as a result of advances in educational knowledge, not in the model of school governance, not in the model of provision. Yeah? It's the fact that we know how to meet kids' needs better now, which is the evidence that we're actually making positive changes. As educators, we know how to do our job better. As governments, they don't know how to do governance any better. In fact, they seem to be making things worse. So, free schools in Sweden, it's a public-private voucher choice system. Every kid has pot of money attached to them. You can go to public or private schools, it doesn't matter. Main thing to remember is that that was introduced on the basis of more parent choice. And what's happened after 20 years is that most of the choice is being made by private corporations, who are the ones who are dominating the establishment of free schools in Sweden. The academies in England have also been in place for nearly 20 years under different models. The approach they've taken in England is to say we need to introduce a range of curriculum specialisations. So some schools become specialist arts providers, some schools will become experts at doing science education, some will be sports academies and so on and so forth. Again, one of the trends that's come through is that because they're seeking business sponsorship, the curriculum specialisation that's tended to emerge most frequently is entrepreneurial types of business. Yeah? And most of the sponsors have been males, the Stephen Joyces of the world who've done really good in business and want to proselytise their view of how to succeed in life across the state school system. The other thing that's never mentioned in terms of our government saying, well, look at free schools, look at academies, they're so popular in England, is that they fail to mention that there are strong financial incentives to go for those models. State schools are underfunded. The only way to get an additional 2.5% or 5% of money out of the system is to opt out of local authority control and go for direct government control. And recently, when the academies didn't have access to that additional funding, the number of applications dried up almost overnight. Yep. So it's the additional funding that you need to be viable that people are chasing, not necessarily a agreed model. In the United States, which is where John Banks and Catherine Isaacs are pointing to as possibly the most attractive models, because that's the only one where there's evidence of some kids benefiting from charter school models. The dominant model that works is called no excuses. And Martin talked about the sorts of narrowing of the curriculum practices that would occur inevitably under league tables and national standards. Exactly the same evidence coming out from the United States. The most well-known no excuses model is the Knowledge is Power program, and a right-wing foundation in the United States is bringing out the head of that organisation to talk about the benefits of the KIP model in the United States. Anecdotally, it's known as Kids in Prison program. It's curriculum boot camp for kids. So under that no excuses model, kids tend to start around about 7 to 7:15 in the morning. They go through till 5 o'clock at night. They have compulsory homework every night. They come in some Saturdays and weekends. To the extent that somebody has calculated that if you go through an entire no excuses program from the beginning of school to the end, you might end up spending the equivalent of an extra 10 years in learning. That's how they get their results. It's by having kids spending a lot more time learning, by having a draconian behaviour contract. If I raise my eyebrows in a KIP school, then I'm likely to be suspended or get a demerit. If you don't conform, and it's very much a conformity model, if you don't conform, you're out. The other thing is, if you don't pass the grade tests at the end of the year, you don't proceed with your mates. And that leads to huge attrition rates, particularly in the middle schools. So the attrition rates from KIP schools are 30% on average, compared to about 6% in state schools. And for African American males, who are one of the major priority groups, it's only 40%. So huge attrition rates. The schools themselves will point to their wonderful successes. We get 4 times as many students succeeding. What they don't say is that the attrition or the collateral damage is horrendous. Now, where do those kids who had their aspirations ruined in a charter school end up? It's back in the state school system, because state schools do not discard students in the way that these no excuses models do. And lastly, I want to reinforce the notion that in New Zealand in 1989 we decided that we wanted a charter school model that involved parents and communities in a local democracy. So we have elected boards of trustees, parents. Consultation takes place with the local community because the school is located in the local community. Under the current working party proposals, it will be an arrangement between the Crown and the sponsor. So a sponsor decides that they would like to run a charter school here in Tapahu. The Crown negotiates with them, not with the local community. The sponsor then has discretion on whether or not they want the board of trustees to include local parents. Government's very quiet on this. Government is very quiet on the idea that they are removing a layer of local community involvement in schooling, and they're replacing it with a sponsor who is more than likely going to be a philanthropic group or a corporate for-profit provider. That's a radical change to state schooling. How have I got people? Right. What have been the main effects of charter schools overall? Well, in summary, Sweden, England and the USA all have lower PISA rankings than New Zealand. So the government wants to import a model from overseas countries where they perform worse overall in terms of their compulsory education than we do in New Zealand. Secondly, none of those countries have reduced structural educational inequalities. The gap is still as large, if not larger, than it was when they started these reforms. So the government's argument that this reform, charter schools, will solve the problem of educational underachievement is not borne out by the evidence from the countries they say they're drawing their model from. One of the most vocal opponents of charter schools in the United States now is Diane Rabbit. She's a former Assistant Secretary of Education for one of the Bush administrations. She started out as one of the strongest proponents of charter school reforms and high stakes assessment, and she's now changed her mind completely because she's seen the effects. And she uses the phrase miracle schools. She says there are no miracle schools. Charter school proponents will present their model as a miracle for solving the problems of education and underachievement. Of course it doesn't. Commonly, charter schools in overseas jurisdictions have selection, start-up and funding advantages. They overtly or covertly select the students they want. Yeah. They get start-up funding incentives from government, and they're able to attract a lot more money from private sources. Despite that, their results are highly variable. And if the argument is that these charter schools are succeeding, then generally they have more resources than state schools. So my answer to that is, we'll give more resources to state schools. And the other thing that they do is that they engage in unethical practices. For example, the labels that are being used are creaming and cleansing. So they cream the students they want from other local schools, impoverishing them, reducing the number of positive role models of students that exist in those communities, and then they cleanse back to those communities the students they don't want. So completely unethical educational practices are encouraged because of the stakes associated with a contract to improve educational achievement. In terms of the announcements that have already been made by our own working party and in the Ministry of Education's assessment of the impact of charter schools on the system, I just want to finish with a few pointers for you, because these are the things you're going to have to watch out for over the coming months and year as the scheme is announced. The Ministry says that we're going to have to be very careful to ensure that when we're looking at proposals for charter schools, that the educational purposes aren't secondary to the sponsor's purposes. Now, if you know anything about the sorts of people who've said they're interested in running a charter school, Destiny Church, Transcendental Meditation, so yogic flying is the answer to educational underachievement. The Ministry says we have to watch out that it's educational purposes that are uppermost. Now, all the groups that have announced their intentions so far seem to be either faith-based schools, private sector institutions that have no previous interest in the state school system at all. We have to ask ourselves, why are they interested in running a charter school in an impoverished socio-economic community? It's already been decided that they will have non-qualified and unregistered teachers. This one beggars belief. Why on earth would you say we're going to address educational underachievement in the most disadvantaged communities by putting unqualified teachers in place? It's complete ideology. They fudged the phrasing on the Working Party's frequently answered questions site about funding. In England, as I said, there were all sorts of ways of actually giving more money to academy schools than to state schools. And the way that the phrasing is written in the answer to this particular question suggests that that charter schools will have more than they're entitled to, because they'll get a share of central government services funding whether or not they have those services. So whether or not they have significant proportions of students with special educational needs, they'll still get the money for that, and so on and so forth. That's my reading of the statement there. Catherine Isaacs the other night didn't contradict that. If the government wanted to introduce more diversity in the system, it can already do that through Section 156 of the 1989 Education Act. It doesn't need a new category of charter schools. It doesn't need Teachers' Council to create a new category of teacher. It can all be done within the state system with registered teachers. They said that they're going to focus on schools' exclusion and expulsion criteria to make sure that charter schools don't exclude or expel students. But what they haven't addressed is all the covert stuff that goes on. You know, the subtle persuasion that Martin talked about, to make sure either the student doesn't enrol in the first place, or that if they don't keep up the boot camp, that they drop out fairly rapidly. And lastly, it's the most appalling part of the thing. In the government's regulatory impact statement, it identified 3 stakeholders in this charter school experiment. First was the Crown. The Crown puts in money, therefore the Crown is a stakeholder. Second stakeholder is a child, because a child is entitled to receive good education. And the third one is the sponsor. Local community isn't mentioned anywhere. And I think that's an important reminder to us that this whole charter school project has very little to do with the health of the community and the school system as a whole, and much more about opening up the whole system to for-profit providers and other providers who don't want to work within the rules of the system. But I'm moving away from the evidence now towards the ideology. And after Peter's talk, so I'll hand over to Peter now. See you later.